women's participation, decision-making, and access to biodiversity benefits in conservation projects and national policies. Assess how conservation efforts affect men and women differently. Implement international standards for collecting and reporting gender disaggregated data, ensuring national biodiversity monitoring efforts produce comparable, high-quality information. This data should be collected in culturally sensitive ways that ensure local participation. Train local communities, especially women, in data collection processes. Local women should be included in designing, implementing, and evaluating biodiversity policies. Ensure women and marginalized groups have equitable opportunities to participate in and benefit from biodiversity decision-making. Recognize women's traditional ecological knowledge, which can complement scientific data. Protect this knowledge by promoting collaboration among Indigenous women and formal researchers. And lastly, make funding available to enable this change. It is my hope that this event will demand that SBSTTA incorporates these measures, which will empower us to develop transformative strategies that secure biodiversity and sustainable development. By embedding gender considerations into our monitoring, we harness the full spectrum of human potential, ensuring no voice is left behind in our journey toward ecological stewardship and a world that works for women and girls. Thank you so much and hope to have a fruitful deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valentine. A round of applause for that remarkable opening statement. Thank you so much once again. Our first panelist is Amelia Ariguin. She is the coordinator of the CBD Women's Caucus. In her presentation, she is going to shed the light on gender disaggregation indicators to measure gender responsiveness of the GBF and the options available to bridge existing gaps towards 2030. Welcome, Amelia.
Thank you so much. And sorry, I'm giving the back to most of you. I didn't choose the best seat. I want to start by sharing a quote that reflects a bit of the collective thinking that we have from the CBD Women's Caucus regarding this gender data gap. Films, news, literature, science, city planning, economics, the stories we tell ourselves about our past, present, and future. In many ways, the world we live at all, as whole, is designed for men and by men. Research and testimonies have shown us that men are considered the default in data collection processes, and women, if at all, are considered secondary. These all spaces are marked, disfigured by a female-shaped absent presence. This is the gender data gap. The gender data gap isn't just about silence. These silences, these gaps, have consequences. And in that context, that is why, and from that place, we are advocating for, particularly for 4 points that I want to share with you, the position that we have for this SBSTTA 26. And the first one is the disaggregation by gender. We have heard about this, and since last SBSTTA and even since COP, that is not only about how do we measure Target 23, but how do we measure the differentiated impacts, and might be echoing Valentine interventions in several points. But this is really urgent, and we have spoke about it, but we still don't see it in the monitoring framework. That is why we are also inviting the disaggregation on this new column on possible disaggregations to actually be open to an intersectional approach, since this is not only about measuring women and men as binary categories, but about how the differences between those collectives come into play, meaning it's not the same, I guess you all know, it's not the same impacts that the different variables of our identities play. Gender, age, and ethnicity status should be included in the disaggregation, particularly for several targets, starting for those focused on conservation area, conserved and protected areas, because that is totally linked to women's land rights, but another colleague will speak more about that. So I won't go into into details on those. But it's also linked to the consumption, and it's also linked to the productive landscapes. It's about women's contributions, active contributions in the economic system, in the production systems linked to biodiversity. And it's also about recognizing the roles, but also about considering the differentiated impacts. If we are not measuring it, then we cannot address and we cannot transform and we cannot achieve this new reality we want to see. Therefore, our main point, apart from disaggregation by gender, is to adopt a headline indicator. We have heard now in the opening of item 3 that several parties are inclined to keep the monitoring framework as it is, but we also hear that some others are still open, and because they recognize this gap, that we cannot go without a headline indicator, which will continue this silence and that will continue invisibilizing women's contributions and overall the gender dynamics, not only women's participation, but how this the power and how the decision making and how the impacts are influencing differently all of us. The third point is the reinclusion of the gender plan of action indicator. This was already considered since COP15 as a component indicator, but the current proposal from ATEC, is suggesting its deletion simply because by the time when the document was issued, the methodology for the gender plan of action indicator wasn't public, but now it is. It is, and my colleagues will also present it. So we asked the SBSTTA to reconsider the deletion of the gender plan of action implementation as indicator, and to keep it as an option, yes, for headline indicator, but if not, to keep it as a component indicator and allow the parties to also report against that. And I won't go into details about why the gender plan of action is important, because my colleagues will stress that also. And the last point I would like to ask, so we put it here on the table and consider this as an option, is that the mandate of the ATEC should be extended to COP16, or if not the mandate of the ATEC, we need to decide here at SBSTTA 26, how are we going to work in the gaps, in the methodological gaps towards COP16? Should not be delayed towards COP17 or afterwards, because the processes, there are organizations working on closing those gaps, and we need to not to just for the sake of not opening the floor for negotiations, which is actually against what we are supposed to do here. We need to like having this in mind. We need flexibility from the different actors to think fully on how to close these gaps, particularly on section C and the gender disaggregation. My last point comes to the binary indicators. We have said since also last SBSTTA and in several other spaces that the binary indicators methodology is not enough for us in terms of, because we won't be able to hold accountable, all of us, we won't be able to be accountable for in our different capacities to showcase if we are achieving or not, or we are or if we are contributing to the achievement of target 23. So we are proposing that we replace the binary indicator with the headline indicator, but if that won't be the case, considering the different positions of the parties, we at least recommend to keep the target 23 binary indicator as it was in SBSTTA 25, including the questions regarding funding and capacity building, because those are essential enabling conditions to achieve target 23. Thank you so much, Sharon, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Another round of applause to our first panelists. Just to tie to what Amelia has presented to us, we have our second panelist, Gijo Carino. She is the Senior Advisor from the Forest Peoples Program and she will give us a presentation about the links between Target 22 and Target 23 and their experiences in developing the structural, the process, and the outcome indicators with the Indigenous navigators and the experiences at ATEG. Karibu sana.
Thank you very much for having this side event and the opportunity for discussion amongst us. Even during the negotiation of the GBF, we had always seen Target 22 and 23 as closely related because of the linkages and solidarities between Indigenous people and women and the similar problems we have faced in terms of data disaggregation. So when we started work on, you may have heard about the traditional knowledge indicators, it was very evident that national statistics and global data did not have data disaggregated for Indigenous peoples. And that immediately brought us to a prioritization that our tools would have to be community-based monitoring because the real experts and knowledgeable persons about traditional knowledge, but also the rights of Indigenous peoples are the people themselves who are working on the ground, right? So that started a process of developing a community-based monitoring tool, the Indigenous Navigator, which is monitoring the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the SDGs, but also the outcomes of the World Conference. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because there are internationally recognized rights and standards, both for Indigenous people's rights, but also for women's rights, for example, under CEDAW, and the most recent General Recommendation 39 on intersectionality and addressing violence against women and ending discrimination. Therefore, the existence of international standards provides us the core areas for monitoring if we are to get disaggregated data, right? So within the KM-GBF monitoring framework, which is now being discussed and parties giving their opinions, there is the issue of how do you mainstream and how do you retain a specific focus, say within Target 23? And I think in the mainstreaming, we really have to identify which are the core targets that require data disaggregation. Because the ways to bring gender into the mainstream will be either through disaggregation of the key targets, the headline indicators in key targets, or of course the adoption of component and complementary indicators. So that is the way we've attempted to do it with respect to the traditional knowledge indicators. Now, if we look at the specific indicators that are now adopted, and I'm talking about traditional knowledge, traditional occupations, this is very core to women. Yeah, if we generate the data on the occupations that women actually have, then we are providing the data disaggregation that is required for the GBF, right? Also land tenure, and the land tenure indicator in Target 22 is similarly going to be reflected in Target 23. Therefore, again, there are global agencies and governments, but mostly we need to produce the data about land tenure of Indigenous peoples, as we do, and also women, right? And then the participation indicator to ensure participation in all levels and at all stages of decision making. So again, that is a core indicator for Target 23, right? So I think what I'm calling for is how we can bring greater synergies between indicators that are being adopted on traditional knowledge, but because of the parallel needs and requirements, as well as the kinds of tools that will actually bring us into the mainstreaming of the monitoring system through data disaggregation produced by us, but also demanded of the states and of other agencies that have responsibility for this. So yesterday I was listening closely to the discussion on gender responsive GBF, and particularly Target 23. And the focus on the outcomes of the gender plan of action. For me, what was not very well defined within the gender plan of action are the specific areas for gender equality and recognition of women's agency. You know, we cannot just call for gender responsiveness. We really have to identify clearly the areas where we are going for gender equality and greater agency and recognition of the full contributions. And unless those are clearly defined, it will be very difficult for us to either identify the areas for disaggregation or component indicators, or even to define a headline indicator, because a headline indicator has to be very clear as to what it wants to measure. And currently, and I'm sorry I wasn't so attentive when the Target 23 was being addressed in ATEG. But there was that requirement that all of the indicators there have to have methodology, data, etc. And in the absence of that, it wasn't us. It was really within the ATEG evaluation of the level of standard of development of the indicator that decisions were made as to whether or not they would be included or not. I mean, so these are just, I'm just sharing insights, because I think we need to work very closely together, because we are the groups within the GBF who are actually working very much for the same types of indicators, disaggregation, and agency that is required in the GBF. Thanks very much. I hope that was a bit helpful.
I think it was very, very helpful, because highlighting the need to create a synergy between the indicators, the different indicators, and how we can at least come up with indicators that are clear and are achievable is very important. Our next panelist is Eva Harshel. She is from the International Land Coalition, and she is going to share with us the insights on the advancements and the setbacks that are related to achieving Target 23 indicators since the COP15, along with the opportunities that are available towards COP16.
All of that. Thanks. Thanks for the introduction, and just really happy as always to be on a panel where we get to talk about these things and contributing a perspective on women's land rights. So this call of focusing right beyond the overall need for a framework to be gender responsive. We believe that women's land rights are a natural, crucial, really, area of focus where there are good indicators that can guide us, and some data. We can always wish it was better, but some data that already can give us a sense of the situation. So I'm going to start by giving a big picture of women's land rights, kind of what we know, and the status of land rights as being measured in major frameworks and by major indicators. We'll quickly look at how much of that data is available. That's a big question that we always ask. And then what's being done to address the lack of availability. Next slide, please. Great. So this text might be a bit small. I'm sorry for that. But the big picture when we're talking about women's land rights is important to keep in mind. So we know that control over land, not only land, but territories and natural resources, is fundamental to achieving gender justice. This has been recognized in a number of frameworks, and it's also already recognized within the KM-GBF. So women's access to land is well recognized in Target 23, but is implied in Target 22, and I think is arguably underlying the achievement of a number of other land-related targets. Estimates of women's ownership range greatly from 7% to 58%, according to the global SDG database for SDG 142, but rights of women are consistently secondary. So the percentage of men who have ownership or secure rights over land is twice that of women in 40% of reporting countries, which is a massive difference, right? In 40% of those countries, and men control more land than women in 87% of these. So some numbers just reinforcing maybe what we know to be true or suspect to be true, and a point of departure, right? As we're calling for gender equality in a context of land rights. So from the International Land Coalition, we do analysis of different land data sets, looking again at what not only government data, but other data is able to tell us about equal access to land for women and girls. So half of the countries that we evaluated through Landex had weak legal provisions for women's land rights. So SDG 5A2 has a number of proxies that represent kind of ideal conditions for women to access and own land. Only half of those are met in half of the countries. There's a 28-point implementation gap between the legal framework. So we said that the legal framework is not ideal, yet there's even a 28-point gap from that and de facto rights, so ownership or control of land by women. We roll a lot of these data sets into index numbers on a 0 to 100 scale, which makes them a bit easier to process, but then we have to get down in the details to know what they mean. And an important addition is the measurement of perceptions of tenure security. This is one half of SDG 142. It's also been really crucial in the development of the traditional knowledge indicator on land use, change, and land tenure. We know that women on average feel less secure in their tenure security. So while it's important to look at rates of documentation, what proportion of land is held or owned by women, we also want to know if women feel as secure in their rights to tenure as men do, which is often conditioned by the worry that they would lose these rights if their partner were to divorce them or pass. Next slide. So in the Sustainable Development Goals provide globally prominent world women's land rights indicators, and this is a good thing, and it's a reason why they were included, which without much opposition in the global biodiversity monitoring framework. So SDG 142, which I mentioned before, has two components. One is legally recognized documentation. The other is perceived tenure security. This SDG should be disaggregated by sex, and it often is by countries that report. It is not disaggregated by tenure, so we can't see how Indigenous women or women in local communities would experience that differently. 5A1 is an indicator that looks at the effective ownership or control over agricultural land by women. And then 5A2 is a legal framework measurement that looks at whether or not countries meet a number of proxies that would allow women to legally own and control land. So currently, all of these indicators are included in SBSTTA 26.2, in Target 23 and 22 as component and complementary indicators. And implied, again, I would suggest in a number of other targets. Next slide. So the status of data availability. So now when we talk about implementing these indicators and parties using them for reporting, the good news is that a number of parties do already have this data, or they might have best proxy data for this. We see the lines that are, again, I regret, a bit small at a distance, but the pink line at the top is 5A2. That's the indicator monitoring the legal framework in these countries. And we see that that has consistently accelerated, let's say, over time, and has more and more countries. Currently, there are 76 countries. There are actually more, but not all of them have agreed to these assessments being published. So they're sitting with the custodian. The second line, 5A1, is available in 46 countries. This is the proportion of women that have control over agricultural land. Again, in many countries, this data might be available, but not in a format that's exactly compatible with the SDG. There might also be sets of data that are available, but have not been published because the country has not chosen to do so. The two bottom lines, the dark green and the blue, that's 142, the top line being, oh, I hope that's A. Now, oh, I have this on my screen. Yes, A, that's the one that has, so that's the legal documentation, the rates of legal documentation. You can see that that's available in 33 countries. And the second component, the perception of tenure security, which is a harder measurement to get, is available in 22 countries. So this data exists. It's, of course, not without its caveats and concerns. There are concerns about the quality of the data. Much of it is quite outdated as well. A lot of it has been compiled by parties coming from mixed data streams. There also are limited visibility of diverse tenure groups and target groups. Again, as panelists were mentioning, it's difficult to do an intersectional assessment of these indicators due to limits in those variables. Next slide. So again, reframing data needs. So there's a growing recognition that diverse data is needed to capture specific groups and population. Thankfully, the CBD framework encourages parties to employ citizen science and community-based monitoring that might fill some of these gaps. The crucial contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities, for example, is often not accounted for in traditional data. And there's support elsewhere. The United Nations Statistical Division last year launched a collaborative on citizen data. And this was in wide recognition that a number of vulnerable or hard-to-reach groups, including rural populations and especially women, were often absent or underrepresented in official statistics. There are also a number of non-official complementary data sets that could fill part of this gap in the SDGs, also in the monitoring framework proposed here at SBSTTA. So several data sources can contribute to our understanding of progress. On 142, we have Prindex, also Landmark, which looks at Indigenous peoples and local community territories. Again, this can be overlaid with data to understand if there's any correlation with those data sets in areas that are recognized for those communities. The Indigenous Navigator has data, as Joji mentioned, and others. With FAO, we've also adopted the official 5A2 methodology to review the legal framework, and we're now letting legal experts from within the coalition, within the land communities, also carry out that framework as a kind of shadow report, or often working even together with the government to arrive to a joint assessment. ILC members in our Latin American regional platform, Mujer Rural, have also developed their own tool. So again, recognizing that 5A1 data, 142 data is often missing, they built a tool that can collect this data at community level, and they're currently training women in their networks to collect this data. Next slide. So next steps, and here, you know, there are possibly many, but I think a first important one, as we see, is to improve understanding of how parties can use these indicators and report on them. What data is available and what does it say? Ensure that women's land right is recognized as an important pathway to achieving the KM-GBF, recognized in MBSEPs that are developed in a participatory manner. accompany further development of these indicators and consider those that could be elevated to headline status. Another thing here would be the consideration of which complementary data sources are adequate and could be filling data caps for those indicators. Finally, to encourage reporting, and that will be a next step following SBSTTA and the finalization of these indicators at COP16. Next slide. And yep, there I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. I think also from her presentation, we learned that it's good that communities are also involved in how to measure and record this data. That is very important to measure how these targets are monitored and implemented. Our fourth panelists are a collaboration between UNEP-WCMC and the Women for Biodiversity. The presentation is going to be done by Melissa DeCock and Minal Tatpati from Women for Biodiversity, who are going to give us a presentation on the proposed methodology to measure the gender plan of action implementation as a target 23 indicator. Welcome.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Melissa DeCock. I'm the Deputy Director of UNEP-WCMC, and I will be doing the first part of the presentation, after which I shall hand over to my colleague, Manil. Next slide, please. So this draft proposed methodology outlines a draft indicator methodology for review and co-development. It aims to measure the progress towards target 23 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Its aim is to fill a gap in the monitoring framework and specifically provides a methodology for the indicator on national implementation of the Gender Plan of Action, which, as was mentioned earlier, was adopted as a component indicator, COP15. It aims to complement the adopted binary indicator and to support parties in their monitoring of progress to ensure the gender responsive implementation of the GBF. I really want to point out that this isn't our methodology. This is something that we co-developed between UNEP-WCMC and Women for Biodiversity with the generous support of SWED-Bio. But very importantly, the aim is to provide almost a straw man for parties to provide feedback, for stakeholders to provide feedback. It isn't for us. It's to support parties monitor their progress and to ensure the gender responsive implementation of the GBF and obviously to achieve target 23. So in terms of the method, and I will get into a little more detail shortly, but it includes a set of questions with multiple choice answers, which can then be summarized as a quantitative measure that provides a value to measure progress over time. So I'll talk a little further about the measures, the questions shortly, but the aim is to be as simple as possible, recognizing that gender is incredibly nuanced. We are trying to find a way to provide some sort of quantitative measure that you can see whether progress is being achieved or not. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this responds specifically to the Gender Plan of Action. So I just wanted to recap on some of the crucial elements. It contains 3 expected outcomes, which specifically relate to 3 different components of Target 23. Each of these outcomes have specific objectives, as well as a set of indicative actions that enable parties to achieve the corresponding objectives. Thank you. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the aim, sorry, bear with me. The aim is really to co-develop this methodology with parties as well as stakeholders, observers, major groups to make sure that this component indicator is ready for use by COP16. We very much want to support the parties in the development of this methodology and ensure that it's useful for them to use in terms of achieving and reporting progress on T23. And as mentioned, the aim is to assist in filling the gaps in the monitoring framework and support the process of championing gender responsiveness in the GBF. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, there are a number of survey questions, and these are based on the indicative actions listed in the Gender Plan of Actions. And then there's and I'm not going to go into the detail of how it can be done, but it's a very simple index that can be calculated that translates the survey responses into a numerical value, where then you can see how to your progress. And I will touch on this again later, but at the end of the presentation, there will be a link to this document, which details all the survey questions as well as how responses can be calculated into this numerical value. Next slide, please. So the next 3 slides basically run through the 3 outcomes for the Gender Plan of Action. As mentioned, each of the questions relates to the 18 indicative actions and are organized under the 3 expected outcomes and overarching objectives. So, for example, the first set of questions relates to expected outcome 1, which is about all people, in particular, all women and girls, have equal opportunity and capacity to contribute to the objectives of the convention. The questions are framed around the objectives, which are around increasing women and girls' rights to ownership and control over land and access to resources and to water, ensuring equal access for all women and girls to resources, services, and technologies, and identifying, eliminating, preventing, and responding to gender-based discrimination and violence related to control, ownership, and access to resources. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the second set of questions are arranged around outcome 2, which is around biodiversity policy, planning, and programming decisions, which address equally the perspectives, interests, need, and human rights of all people, in particular of all women and girls. And these questions are framed around the objectives related to increasing the opportunities and strengthening the meaningful and effective participation and leadership of women of all levels of action, engagement, and decision-making, and integrating human rights and gender equality into NBSAPs. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the third set of questions is around expected outcome 3, enabling conditions are created to ensure gender-responsive implementation of the GBF. I'm not going to read all of the text on the screen. This presentation can be shared with you, but it's around developing national capacity to produce and use gender and biodiversity data, including relevant data disaggregation, supporting access to information and public participation of women and girls organizations, networks, and leaders, and of course, very importantly, allocating adequate human and financial resources to support rights-based, gender-responsive implementation of the GBF. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So in terms of the process for data collection, there's 2 levels that are envisioned. The first is the national level. This methodology is available now for comment, but once it is finalized, will be available for countries, parties to do an assessment themselves of where they stand, and then they can understand where they, how much progress there is, where they need to act, where they're doing well, where they're not doing so well. And at a global level, this could be integrated into their national reporting and shared with the Secretariat. The next point that I'm going to be making is it would very much depend on the Secretariat, but with resources and with support, and if possible, the Secretariat may be able to collate all of these survey responses into a global level. So now I hand over to my colleague, Manil.
Next slide, please. Yeah, so like Melissa said, this has the indicator, the metadata has just been collated, and we wanted to really get different stakeholders as well as parties to look at the metadata and let us know if they had any comments and suggestions on it. And so we organized 3 sessions, 2 of which were in April. And these were informal sessions where we didn't really attribute particular comments to anybody, but we just wanted open, honest feedback. So we had 2 sessions in April where for different regions and different parties to be accommodated. And we had some very interesting sort of questions as well as comments on the indicators. And we are hoping that the group here as well also looks at the metadata and gives us comments needed. And I'm sure with the speakers who have come before also, there's so much knowledge available already. It would be really great if you could contribute to this metadata as well. Like Melissa has already suggested, the metadata was based on the inclusion of the gender action plan in the global biodiversity framework. And it is specifically based on the 18 activities that are attributed to parties in the gender plan of action. So there were some very interesting comments that came out of it. Next slide. So some of the key messages that came out were, how are we going to ensure that all of these activities and the metadata itself is going to be taken up by the NBSAPs, because they're supposed to be prepared before COP16. And this was actually a lot of parties as well as stakeholder groups brought up this question. So it is a question that we are asking ourselves as well. The other thing that was said was by parties was that they see the synergies of the gender plan of action with other gender action plans in different Rio conventions, and that it is important. And I think that is the reason why we saw, I think, a few countries who really took it up today, parties who took it up today, because they see the importance of including the gender action plan. And they have other conventions as well that they are party to. The other thing that some parties also said was that we need the gender action plan to complement and respond to other indicators and other targets in the monitoring framework as well, which is a very important point. And possibly there have to be more collaborations developed so that we can look at it and how we can respond to this. And then there were questions on many countries not having national policies or legislation with respect to land. So it is very much, even now, it is very much ownership of land, but we know that a lot of women do not have ownership, or many communities which women belong to also don't really have ownership of land, but access to land and use of fruct rights. So how do you ensure that? So these are some of the questions that came up, and I think it's important for us to also look at them. Next slide. So we would really want everybody to look at the metadata and send us comments. We are still working on it. All of these information sessions and today's session as well, there's so much that has opened up with just some of the presentations that came up. It would be really helpful for all this expertise to be added to the indicator methodology. And we would really want your feedback. So Aisha, who is our colleague from UNEP-WCMC, is collating the comments. So please, you could send it to her. And the links to the draft methodology are also available. If anybody needs it, we have a few copies also with us. So if you can look at it and just make your comments on the copies and give them back to us also. We are here till the end of SBI, so we would really appreciate if you could just look at the methodology and give us some comments. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melissa and Minal. Also, I think from their discussion, they are raising the issues that women are facing towards the land tenure in respect to control, the security, and just ownership of these lands. That's a key factor of production. Our speakers have just finalized on their presentations, and now it is our turn. The members present here and also those available online to interact with the panelists in terms of comments and questions that you might have. So the floor is open to questions and comments from the members.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for all of your presentations. I was just wondering, you mentioned that this indicator, you're aiming for it to be ready by COP16. What exactly is pending now, apart from the feedback from users? Is there another process ongoing on this indicator, or is it just the feedbacks that you're waiting for?
I assume you mean on the methodology. Yeah. So as I said, this isn't our methodology. It's something that we want to support parties to do. So what we're doing here at Substo and SBI is inviting parties and stakeholders to provide their inputs so that we can refine the methodology and then reshare it with them, with the aim that by CBD, we will have something that they're happy with. Thank you.
Can I also-
Yes.
I think the key point is also that parties need to add the gender plan of action and keep it in the component indicator as was suggested. That is the main area of concern right now. So I think everybody here wants that to happen. So we're just hoping for that, but we would also want to keep this ready so that it can be taken up by parties if they want to nationally as well. So.
I don't know if anyone else from the panel wants to respond on that. No? Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much. I am working for UNEP. I like the idea of collecting data at the community level and rolling up, which is very difficult, but that is the only way, I guess. At the national level, you don't know the aggregate data, where those data come from and why you see what you see. So to do that, we need to have some standards that are applicable for those communities that are providing. So I don't know whether you can give a bit more details on how you are doing it with the citizen scientists, because I guess in the developing countries, the citizen scientists' activities are rather weak at the moment. And I also think that the interconnectivity with other indicators is such an important issue, because rather than imposing gender indicators, we have to see where the biodiversity targets, how gender should be integrated to really shows the meaningful as others can see the value of gender integration. So I think that exercise also need to be done. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll say something a bit more. Right now, we're going to have the negotiations on the binary questions. So that is completely open as to how to strengthen the binary questions, which parties will have to report to in the online reporting tool. Now, I'm aware that the binary questions as of now are not perfect, but then they can be improved. I'll give another example where we will try to make an impact here. The binary indicator in traditional occupations is asking what measures are parties taking to support customary sustainable use of indigenous peoples and local communities, including the implementation of the plan of action on customary sustainable use. So we have actually identified the measure that we will measure, we'll ask parties to measure whether they are implementing the plan of action on customary sustainable use, which exists within the CBD. And to some extent, the gender plan of action is indeed a measure that can be mentioned in the structural indicators, in the binary indicators. Because binary indicators only measure structure and process. What are governments planning to do? Indeed, it doesn't measure the outcome. And the outcomes can only be measured through the people themselves feeling that they're advancing in terms of gender equality and gender responsiveness. So, or engaging in improving the binary indicators within the current framework, because that they're attempting to fix it now for adoption at COP16. So I don't know if synergies can be made there, because I
really important monitoring that could inform those. So I think that will happen. We've seen uptake of that kind of data vary a lot across countries. Kenya actually has very advanced guidelines for how citizen data can be integrated into the national statistical system. So this was a cooperation and the process of, or the result of a mechanism that the government set up to understand how this kind of data could complement SDG data collection. And now other countries are trying to learn from this experience, build on this, and the collaborative on citizen data that I mentioned, they intend to issue guidelines that could be then used as international guidance for how this data could be taken up in national reporting and statistical systems, right? So I think that's promising. It's still very much a trust building exercise, right? For a long time, we've seen government data here and on the other side, shadow reports, alternative reports. And now I think there's recognition for what those data sets and processes can do together. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your questions. And I just want to compliment a bit regarding the disaggregation exercise that you mentioned. Totally agree with you that needs to be further developed. But since last SOPSTA, the CBD Women's Caucus provided guidance on how some elements could be included in particular targets. And once again, we are reiterating how those inclusions could be done, for example, in the goal C, where they are aiming to monitor, right, the monetary and non-monetary benefits. So there are particular targets, as you mentioned. It's not for all targets that the segregation could be done, or not for all the component or complementary, but there are some that they just need a small tweak just to include it. And that's perhaps the ask that we have for this substa. But we have also heard that perhaps it's not going to happen at the global level. But then what we want to see is that some parties take the ownership of that, and maybe their national systems, they can actually commit to the disaggregation. Goal C is one of our priorities, regarding the monetary and non-monetary benefits. Goal D about the funding, because how we see it is also how the monitoring framework relates not only to the GBF, but the parallel instruments that support the GBF implementation as the resource mobilization strategy, and how that other one is going to be measured, because there's no point on having parallel instruments if they're not going to be also measured. So we see this as a cross reference exercise that maybe we need further development, but as the GPA methodology should be a multi-stakeholder exercise based on what can be done and what is needed, just to complement a bit. Thanks.
That's okay. Yeah. All right. One of the online members has asked a question. I'm not sure if Amelia has answered it very clearly. It's it borders what you have spoken about. But the question is, how can the gender plan be included or incorporated in the NBSAPs?
Was the question, how can the gender action plan be incorporated into NBSAPs? So one would need to engage with the focal points who are leading on NBSAPs in country. I think everybody's probably aware of the Jeff Early Action Support work on NBSAPs. There is gender guidelines being developed at the moment. And it would be, I can take that to the people developing them to include the reference to the gender action plan. I do not know, plan of action. I do not know whether it's there at the moment. So the one is to engage the development of guidelines which are being developed by UNDP and UNEP under the NBSAP's early action support. But very importantly, stakeholders need to engage with parties that are leading on the development of their NBSAPs. And provide them with tangible guidance as to how to do it. So not just say, you should use this and provide it, but say, here we can talk you through the relevant areas, how to include it, how to mainstream it, and that sort of thing. Thanks.
Brilliant. Yeah. Another question from our member here.
Thanks. I don't know whether it's a question or a comment, or just a reflection, actually. And it's based on what has been happening in the negotiations and in the ARTEC, but also the event that you had here 2 days ago, which I felt was actually very, very useful, and which actually raised a number of questions from some of the parties. So first of all, well, I really hope that the component indicator will be put back for target 23. I think one of the parties already put it on the table this morning, so I hope there will be much more support for that. However, in terms of operationalizing it, there were some questions raised by some parties the other day about some overlap, for example, with some of the binary indicator questions, and maybe that's related to what Josie was saying there as well. So particularly those questions in the methodology there that refers to whether the country has developed, policies and laws and mechanisms. There is clearly some overlap with the binaries. So some of the parties are saying, if we are already responding to some of those questions in the national reports, why are we asked to report again under another questionnaire, right? So practically. So my suggestion would be in the further development of this methodology to see how to reduce that overlap or maybe to suggest some of those questions related on the structural and process indicators to maybe strengthen the binary indicator. But then the one for target 23 I think it should employ what we call in section C a human rights-based approach to monitoring, which looks at structural process and outcome indicators. And that's where citizen science and community-based monitoring actually come very strong into the picture here. So to get the responses from parties, I don't think would be sufficient to really see the outcome, for on equality, at the local and national level. So that's where you also need data being generated by the right holders themselves, by women and girls. And so how can you reduce the overlap with the binary indicators, and how to make it a more, wholesome indicator that addresses, especially the outcomes on the ground for right holders. So I wouldn't rely only on parties' responses. It should be something that anybody can contribute. And, there wasn't much progress. I mean, there were a lot of gaps and weaknesses in the monitoring framework adopted at COP15. But one of the key things that was already highlighted here is that paragraph 6 really asks the parties to recognize and support community-based monitoring and information systems and citizen science, and recognize their roles in the monitoring framework. So as Eva was saying, this is a massive opportunity that I think we really need to make use of it and make it, at the same level as party reporting in a sense, and give it as much strength as possible. So I know it's, it's putting a lot of maybe extra work on us or on you in terms of the methodology, but keeping it limited to parties, I see it somehow as, as a bit of a limitation. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. I'm actually going to ask if the floor can be given to Kathy, who's online with her hand raised, and she'll respond. Super, thank you.
Kathy, could you unmute yourself?
Okay, now it's working. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for the question, Mauricio. What we have done so far is, and obviously thinking that parties will have to have a finalized framework by COP16, and basically SBSTTA 26 is our last chance to ensure key recommendations to finalize the monitoring framework. We went ahead with the decisions that we had at hand. This was the first monitoring framework, decision 15.5, that included indicator on the national implementation of the gender plan of action. So we had to go back to that decision, to 15.11, which is meant to be implemented by parties in following a gender responsive approach in the implementation of the global biodiversity framework. As the time is limited, and we've heard over and over again that parties have limitations, that there's no appetite for opening the monitoring framework to a lot of indicators or spending too much time developing new methodologies, we went ahead with a review of the gender plan of action and develop questions that are based on the actions that have already been adopted. And these are 18 out of 30 actions that are meant to be led by parties, that if parties lead these efforts will contribute towards the objectives and the overall outcomes that are envisaged in the gender plan of action. Those outcomes from the gender plan of action address the key components of target 23, and that's why we think that it would be important to include this measure. So for the purposes of including an alternative to the binary or a complementary to the binary, we've developed this methodology. Obviously, this process was done in parallel to the group, to the work on binary indicators from the ATIC. But now, based on inputs from the in-person meeting that was led on Saturday with a lot of participation from parties, it became clear that there are a couple of things that need to happen. Depending on the outcomes of SAFSTA, if parties decide to go ahead with a binary indicator and those questions are finalized and there are clear recommendations from SAFSTA 26, what we are going to do with this methodology is obviously adapt it to the methods and find a way to, for two processes, basically, for parties to have the option to use the binary indicator and those questions and find an alternative with the CBD Secretariat. And again, what is discussed at SBI in terms of the national reporting template, and find a way for parties that want to further look at the enabling conditions, which are not necessarily being looked at in the latest proposal for Annex 1 and the binary indicators. For example, for the binary indicator for target 23, the key questions related to enabling conditions were deleted. So it's not providing a complete picture about progress towards the achievement of target 23. So finding a way that parties can report on the questions that are already on the table and follow up with further questions that are included in this methodology. In terms of the method of calculation, the binary indicator calculation proposed is different, but if it makes sense to find to complement these two methodologies, we'll make an effort to make it as easy as possible for parties that want to dig deeper and look at the implementation of the gender plan of action. Then we will provide that option. Another option that was put on the table, I think by a couple of people on Saturday, was perhaps in Annex 1 of the national reporting, when parties report on the gender plan of action, this methodology could be used then to show quick progress in terms of the implementation of the gender plan of action, in addition with information about what actions have actually been taken on the ground. But I love your suggestion about exploring, and to be honest, being realistic is going to be tricky now, looking at SAFSTA wrapping up the recommendations and this being forwarded for decision by COP. But either way, it will be very interesting to explore how this methodology can also be used at the community level with their own perceptions of what happens on the ground. I know that we've had these discussions in relation to participation for Target 22. We were exploring options for mirror surveys, one that are answered by parties and others that are answered by the relevant groups. And obviously that would be some interesting work that we could collaborate on. I hope this answers the questions, and thank you so much for the question. We really did our best to try to put something on the table that parties can build on, that this important indicator remains in the monitoring framework. It's not perfect, but we do hope that adds value to what's on the table right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for that comprehensive answering or clarifying of that. I'm not sure if we have any question from the members present. No? Okay. Yes, please. Amelia wants to speak.
Yeah, well, I just want to share an invitation that Sunday, May 19th, in this room, there's going to be a dialogue on the implementation of the Gender Plan of Action, organized with the Secretariat from 9 to 1. The invitation will be shared to those that actually subscribe to the Women's Caucus newsletter or join us. So we can share with you the full details, but it's going to be in this room from 9 a.m. to 1 And yeah, there's gonna be coffee break. And the objective is to, towards COP17, start working on the advancement of the implementation of the GPA.
Thank you so much, Amelia, for that invitation. Just to wrap it up, since our time has now come to an end, we invite those who are parties to support the Women's Caucus, to show the support to the Women's Caucus initiatives in their advocacy inputs, so that our voices are heard and are put as part of the document going forward. So to finalize, I want to thank all of you for joining us, taking your time to be part of this important side event. We hope it has been impactful, and it is going to be forge the spirit of what we are working on towards during this SBSTTA. Thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon.